Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'd like to continue our discussion of anthropology. There will be quite a lot of name dropping today, but it's just to familiarize you with some scholars who are very important in the field of anthropology and whose theories are still discussed today. So something that will eventually be repeated even during this course many times. So if you hear those names for the very first time, just familiarize yourself with them. Perhaps explore a little more. You can just Google the names that are on the slides, or you can read a little more. I uploaded a few additional books to the Moodle page, the one for those who get interested in the lives and works of those scholars today. I recommend you at least browse through Jerry Moore's Visions of Culture, which is exactly about these scholars and some more that we don't have time to discuss at greater length. So if you get interested, absolutely go and see those books, especially Visions of Culture. So we'll talk about the scholars from the 20th century mostly. Some of them were born in the second half of the 19th century, but they were most professionally active in the 20th century. Some of them come from the English-speaking world. There are a few Americans, as you can see, and the United States starts really being perceived as the leading country in social studies, in humanities generally. Before the war, after the war, even more, because many scholars from Europe escaped from the persecution, especially those who had a Jewish origin in Germany. They escaped to America from the Nazis, and many of them stayed in America and continued their work there. There will be some other scholars, many of them French. In the 20th century, France also becomes a very important place for cultural studies, and it's especially visible towards the end of the 20th century with postmodernism. Many, not all, but many important scholars from this school of thought are French, and they follow in the footsteps of some great names before them. So let's look at the names and works of these leading founding fathers and mothers of anthropology and generally social studies and culture studies. So the first man on the list here, like the grandfather of American anthropology, is Franz Boas. He was very modern in his attitudes to scholarship, in his methodology. He was one of the first humanists who were against all forms of determinism and hierarchy of cultures. He believed that cultures should be seen in a pluralistic and relativist sense, so they should not be judged from the perspective of the culture of the scholar, him or herself. He debunked many of the pseudosciences of the 19th century, like craniometry, this racist theory attributing some meaning or some indication of the intellect to the measurements of the skulls, and basically trying to argued that the physical differences between different variations of human beings were resulting in intellectual differences. He didn't believe that. He thought it was absolute lie, really. He also wrote against what he called armchair anthropology, so the kind of scholarship that the Victorian anthropologists preferred, that is reading in the library rather than going on an expedition and talking to the people that you studied. He believed in empiricism, in actually doing research in the field. He mostly studied the Inuit, or as the old world goes, the Eskimos, the people of the far north. He was very influential as a mentor, as a teacher to at least 2 more generations of scholars. His probably most important students, former students, were Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead. We'll talk about both ladies in a little moment, but also people like Alfred Kreber, who studied Native Americans, and Edward Sapir. He also studied Native Americans. He was mostly interested in language, and you may remember, you may have heard already, or you will, about the so-called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, namely the studies in which the scholars tried to find the connection between the language that people speak and their perception of the world. So the connection between the language and perception. A very famous example, like some northern nations have many words for snow. According to this hypothesis, it means the people who use these languages actually perceive snow, different types of snow, more acutely. So if there is a different word, let's say for dry snow and wet snow, it means it's important for the culture, and it's important, it actually makes the people notice that. So the two female scholars that were both the followers and former students of Franz Boas were Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead. Ruth Benedict was a generation older, so Margaret Mead was a student of both Boas and Benedict. They were both American, very important. They were authors of very important books. For Ruth Benedict, her most important book was called Patterns of Culture. She published it in the 1930s. She was mostly interested in studying Native American cultures, especially the Pueblo cultures. She believed in what she called psychological anthropology. She believed that cultures are a little bit like personalities. So there are different kinds of human behaviors that are possible, but each person only chooses a few, well, chooses subconsciously, of course, chooses from all those potential behaviors a few characteristics. So some are, I don't know, more assertive, some are more caring, some are, I don't know, more, let's say, athletic than others. And she believed that each culture also behaves in such a way. So from what she called the great arc of human potentialities, each culture configures, she called it configurationalism, because each culture configures some characteristics that really define this culture. Margaret Mead was a student of both Ruth Benedict and Franz Boas. She was mostly famous for her book from 1928, Coming of Age in Samoa, in which she studied sexuality and growing up in tribal societies. She went to Samoa, she went to New Guinea, and tried to see how the tribal societies raise their children, especially the teenagers, the young people who enter, let's say, the adult world, the world of sexual relations. And she believed, she went there and she spoke to the people living there, especially women, about their growing up and about the sexual morality there. And she believed she found the paradise. She found the place where there were no sexual taboos, where there were no restrictions, where young people could explore their sexuality freely. So this was a myth of free sex, which was very fascinating for the people, for the Americans of the interwar period. This is the interwar period when she did her study. So they believed this was the paradise. She thought that human nature is very adaptable, and social and cultural conditions are more important than physiology. So people are mostly influenced by society, not by nature. She believed that this upbringing in the exotic lands such as Samoa was much better than the traditional American upbringing, with all the sexual inhibitions, with all the taboos, with all the forbidden behaviors. This was something that her contemporaries found absolutely fascinating. But even more interesting, this has been challenged in the 80s. In 1980s, another scholar called Derek Freeman went back to Samoa and actually found some of the women that Margaret Mead talked to. They were old ladies by then, but they remembered Margaret Mead, and they thought, they told him they were all making fun of her. They made up all those crazy stories about unrestricted sex and just complete freedom of the young people. This was not true, they said. And Derek Freeman, you may want to Google it. There is a very interesting documentary on YouTube. Just Google Derek Freeman, Margaret Mead, Samoa, perhaps. So you can see the scholar and the whole controversy. It's absolutely fascinating. It shows that perhaps this was all a joke on the part of the subjects of the study, but nevertheless, the book by Margaret Mead was so important and so influential and so widely discussed because it answered some sort of cultural need of the Americans in the interwar period. So as you can see, it's really, really very interesting. Another name is a Polish-British scholar, Bronisław Malinowski. His most famous book, Życie seksualne dzikich. It also looks like he was interested in sexual life of savages in northwestern Melanesia. So he went far away, talked to the people, and wrote a book with sex in the title. Apparently the book itself, I read it, it's not much about sex. He just wanted a catchy title. But what he believed was what he called functionalist anthropology. So that social and cultural institutions serve basic human needs. So that culture develops out of human need, of human necessity. He also believed in participatory observation. He believed that first of all you should know the language of the people you study, you should go there, live with them, and stick to facts rather than listen to what people say. So he wouldn't probably be much impressed by the work of Margaret Mead. He believed that you should really stick to field work and facts and be skeptical and not believe everything that your subjects tell you. He was quite influential as well Some of the scholars influenced by him are Alfred Radcliffe Brown or Edward Evans Pritchard. They were also the former students of another important scholar, Émile Durkheim, a French scholar we'll discuss in a little moment. So he is still respected, he is still remembered. Another important scholar, this time from Australia, is Vere Gordon Childe. And before his studies, there was a traditional division from the middle of the 19th century into Stone Age, then Bronze Age, then Iron Age. Vere Gordon Childe believed this wasn't that simple. He introduced the concept of what he called revolutions, 3 revolutions: the Neolithic Revolution, the Urban Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution. So he believed that the development of the human society happens in great leaps, in revolutions, rather than through slow development. He was Australian, but he mostly worked in Scotland. He studied the very famous Neolithic ruins of Skara Brae in the Orkney Isles, and he wrote a very important book entitled Man Makes Himself. Then we have some French first half of the 19th century, of the 20th century. They were sometimes born in the 19th century. French sociologists, so it's not really anthropology but sociology, so rather studying social institutions and social behavior. The first of the two is Émile Durkheim. He believed in what he called structuralist anthropology, so he believed that social institutions could be seen as objective and autonomous social facts. But what is really important, he believed that the society has much more influence on individual people than people have on the society. So the institutions are stronger than individual people. The influence on everyday life by the social institutions is so great that no single human can oppose it. He was interested in the modernity. We'll return to his studies, especially his studies on suicide later on, at some later stage when we talk about modernity, just to indicate he noticed that in the modern urban society the statistics for suicide were much higher, and he wondered why. We'll talk about his findings later on. He believed in some aspects of psychoanalysis, like the collective unconscious, which was introduced mostly by Jung, not by Freud, but by Jung. He believed that these inborn predispositions were strengthened by upbringing. This is something that many scholars will return to. So he was the mentor of these two scholars that I already mentioned while talking about Bronisław Malinowski. So Alfred Radcliffe Brown, who studied society as a stable, self-regulating system, and Edward Evans Pritchard, so he was interested in primitive religions. Very many of the followers of Émile Durkheim were interested in religion. For example, Mary Douglas, comparative religion, concepts of pollution and danger, and also Marcel Mauss. He introduced some aspects of the traditional beliefs of the American Indians, especially the customs relating to gift exchange, especially the concept of potlatch. If you never heard about it, Google it, it's very interesting. This was a ritualized practice of exchanging gifts. And the last one in this part is Claude Lévi-Strauss. You may have heard about him already. He's very famous. He's still very respected. He combined Durkheim's sociology with linguistics. Linguistics as proposed by Ferdinand de Saussure. If you haven't heard about this great linguist, you certainly will in linguistic courses. He believed that humans are part of the structure, and the structure rules human behavior. This is something he took from Durkheim, basically. He believed also, and this is moving beyond Durkheim, that social life is based on a system of symbols. Symbols coded in the subconsciousness. He believed that there are units of myth called mythms, a little bit like memes later on, and that human nature is unchanging. Many books, probably the most influential one is called Structural Anthropology. However, his big breakthrough came in the 1950s with Tristes Tropiques, which is the original French title, or The Sadness of the Tropics. He wrote The Savage Mind, The Raw and the Cooked, so you can see that he was, for example, interested in food culture, in culinary culture. And we continue in a moment.